Welcome to the Master B2B Fireside Chat series. My name is Brian Beck, co-founder of Master B2B, a thought leadership series and community of e-commerce professionals in B2B. I'm joined today on this Fireside Chat by Murugan from TCS. He's my co-partner and a co-pilot in these interviews where we're talking about key issues in B2B e-commerce in an informal way with industry leaders. And we're excited to have with us today Mr. Ellery Fisher, who is the CIO, let me make sure I get this right, at McKesson Medical Surgical. McKesson Medical, did I get that right, Ellery? Excellent. And what we love about Ellery is he has such an amazing background. He's been at B2C, B2B companies. He was at Amazon and Walmart and all kinds of places over his career. So you've seen it all, Ellery. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Murugan. Really excited for the chat. I think you hit it. I grew up in consumer. Really kind of focused on businesses that thought about digital retailing, and it's easy to think in terms of the customer, the person who's choosing. It's all one, right? Like it's easy to be familiar with your customer, and have grown throughout my career into roles that sort of began to get into B2B, and then my current role are almost entirely B2B in nature. And there's an awesome complexity there, where you're thinking about the needs and wants and behaviors of many different people when you think about serving one customer, which is an interesting layer of complexity. I think there's also there's a cool thing happening right now where like the B2B industry used to think in very practical, mechanical terms about serving its customers, right? Like, it was cost and availability and those matter, right? The experience part, though, I think is really risen in prominence in the last few years, where it's not just, what can you do, but how do you do it?
Awesome.
And that's been fun to get to watch and now be a part of.
Well, that's awesome context. And thank you for that, because, we're going to talk today about ROI, right? And building the business case. And, just a little context, what we see in talking to, Murugan sees this too, I think, is talking to a lot of B2B companies. They're very conservative. They tend to business case everything to death, and really are think about, or at least historically have thought about e-commerce and digital investments as only driving incremental business, things like that. Where I like to say, and I've said this on other Fireside Chats, Murugan, right? It's more of an existential approach necessary, right? So we're going to get into that conversation in just a moment. Murugan, anything you want to add on what you're seeing?
I think I'm very excited for the conversation with Ellery, mainly because there's a lot of people who've seen convergence from a distance.
Yeah.
But Ellery, I know, has seen it through his career.
Yeah.
The B2B, B2C mix is something that it's going to definitely throw up some new perspectives that some of us are seeing from the outside, wherein Ellery's lived through all of that. So I'm really excited for this.
Yeah, me too. So, all right, Ellery, let's get into the meat of it then. Let's start with our first question here, which is all about, your experience, really. You were already alluding to it. B2C, B2B. What's the differences you see there in terms of how B2B, approaches digital investments, alignment, gaining the necessary budgets and internal alignment around it versus what you've seen in B2B? Is B2B learning from B2C, like you were saying earlier, or kind of what's the difference that you've observed?
It is very much. I think convergence is the right word. And I think there's two pieces of it, right? One is a recognition that as the experience on the consumer side, especially of digitally transacted like product and service, has gotten higher and higher over time, and it's become more and more ubiquitous, it's raised the expectations when those same people like put on their badge and go to work. Yeah. And all of a sudden, these systems that really didn't invest the time and energy into experience that they're being forced to interact with are not satisfying. And you get these people asking why, right? Why isn't this as good as Amazon? Why isn't this as good as Travelocity? Like, why doesn't this just know what I need the way that Netflix does? And, those people sit in jobs where they're in capacities to influence decisions, right? Or, they are customers of companies that offer these. And they ask people like me, why isn't your system as easy to do this with as Amazon is? And that's a very valid question. I think the other part of it, aside from just, raising expectations driven by people's consumer interactions, is beginning to understand a little bit kind of deeper the way in which digital experience creates tangible value for customers, right? And you see it even in the language being used, right? Like you didn't talk about it as e-commerce the way that consumer companies thought of it, where like one of the first things I learned as a trainee at Target, our CEO was like addressing all of us. He goes, what do we sell here? And people are like listing out stuff, Tide laundry detergent, kids clothes. People are, our private brands, right? Only we have our private brands. And he's like, no, other people sell that stuff. We sell a Target branded shopping experience. That's our product. The experience is our product.
Yep.
And I think the consumer industry was clear on that a really long time ago. I think the distribution industry, it's more complicated, right? Experience is a part of it, but then, the actual distribution piece, assortment piece, expertise, like there's a lot of layers. And I think the value of experience is coming into focus now in a way that it hadn't before, where, if you can sit in front of a customer and go, my technology delivers a better, more efficient experience that will save your employees time. And like everyone knows right now in like the inflationary economy, the time of your employees is, valuable times 10.
Yeah.
That's meaningful, right? That's like showing up and saying like, I can deliver things at a lower cost without having to offer a lower cost, right? Like you've created value in a new way. And I think as B2B companies are starting to understand that that's a potential differentiator, it's becoming more and more interesting to invest in.
Interesting. So customer experience, and Murugan, you have a follow-up question here too, but just real quick, the experience, how do you sell that as a part of your CEO sitting in front of you, Ellery, and you're presenting your business case for 2024, right? And where your CFO's sitting there, and the CFO's looking at a spreadsheet trying to figure out, what's my return on this customer experience here, Ellery? What does that mean? How do I quantify that? Can I?
That's exactly it, Brian. I think it's important to understand that customer experience is the sum of a lot of things. And you have to make sure that they're tangible and measurable. And this is no different than consumer, right? Like when you look at, how aligned are you to a business's strategy? Like when your strategy is to offer differentiated services, when it is to improve outcomes for your customers, whether they be, patients or providers, payers, pharmaceutical companies. And in the case of McKesson, we serve all of those different cohorts. Then it's saying like, how does this investment and experience measurably support that? What tangible thing does it give us that we can put in front of our customers that they care about, that is going to make us a more valuable provider to them, where they will choose our goods and services over those of a competitor because they value what we can offer, and we can measure it, right? Measure both that it delivers that incremental business.
Okay.
And the incremental business, again, it comes down to your strategy. If your strategy is retention, does it improve our measured satisfaction? Does it improve our loyalty rate, right?
Yep.
Like if we say we want to make sure that our relationship with our best customers isn't just as good as it's ever been, we take it to new heights. How are we going to measure it? And how are we going to link back these investments to improvement there? Right. And like measurement, I would say, it's not a new trick in the consumer industry. It's not a new trick in the B2B industry either, right? You go and ask the supply chain team of a B2B company, like, and that was the first thing I did when I got here, by the way. I went and asked the supply chain team, when you ask for a big giant check to build a new warehouse, like what story do you tell? Like, how do you arrange the business case for that so that you can explain the value? And it clicked. I'm like, the B2B industry understands this issue perfectly. Right? They're just used to thinking about these kinds of investments and different kinds of assets. They're physical assets, usually, that deliver a business capability. But that something is a virtual asset, a digital asset, like it has a lot of the same dimensions and qualities. And you just have to explain it within the framework that company is already good at using to evaluate its investment decisions.
Fascinating. Murugan, I think you're chomping at the bit here to ask a question. Go for it.
Right. So, Ellery, thank you so much for that. This shift in demographics that's driving this newfound empathy for how the customers feel. Is it also pushing the product stack to be kind of similar to what you were observing in the B2C world, or is that still very different between B2B and B2C?
No, I think it is increasingly similar. Now, it's not always the same, right? B2B, like complexity is the name of the game, right? Like I joke with people like, the quadrants are great if you're selling t-shirts and tennis shoes. But when you're making technology decisions for a B2B enterprise, it's not about like what's in the top right. It's like selecting an organ to transplant into a patient. There's not like what's the best one. There's a question of what's the right one. Like what is a match to the patient? We have all these unique complexities to our business. What is exactly the right asset that meets those complexities and allows us to do whatever it is we do for our customer in the best way possible? That would be the only difference, I would say, is that like normally in the B2C industry, you're serving a consumer cohort that is fundamentally similar in persona. And so you can go, yeah, this is what excellent looks like. And it is generally true in most instances. In B2B, it's harder to generalize. Like it is much more specific to what you're doing, for who, in what context. In a big diversified enterprise like McKesson, we have many answers to those questions. And so then it becomes like, is it one stack or many stacks? And, where does it make sense to embrace commonality? Where does it make sense to embrace differentiation? I think those are the unique facets in B2B where you have to account for the complexity in slightly different ways. But I would say in general, the approaches, the way that you start to think about what the stack looks like in the technology is very much driven business outcome and experience on down, which in my mind is, that's what I'm used to seeing in the consumer industry. I think it's not that it's totally new in B2B, but I would say that it is not as well established yet. But it's moving very, very quickly in that direction.
So question on that. There's so many, Ellery, there's so many options, so many things you could focus on. And, you're talking about the analogy of, the supply chain warehouse or even the body and picking your right organ, right? So I love that one, by the way. Of all the things you could be doing, how do you prioritize? There's AI is here, you get companies experimenting with that. You've got site search and personalization. You've got multi-channel sales enablement tools and all kinds of things you could do. How do you decide what the priority is for McKesson?
Well, it's a good question, right? And I think this does not significantly differ from any other business. You have to look at two big things and in specific order. One, what is your business strategy? Mm-hmm. Your priorities should always align to that. Like when you're saying, what are the technology investments I need to make? They're the technology investments that best align to what your business needs to accomplish in order to win the way that it defines that. The second one is really about readiness for the future. Mm-hmm. And so it comes down to whatever your forecast is for the future of your segment and the forecast for technological capabilities, right? And so if we say 5 years from now, how will our circumstances be different? And how will that change the way we would answer the same business strategy need? So like we know how we're going to answer it today, but 5 years from now, how will this be different? So like if I were to roll the clock back like 5 years, it was about cloud, right? Like we're going to build something new. Well, I don't know. Do we build it using our own data center again, or should we build it on the cloud? If you were using that moment in time, data center probably made sense. But if you said 5 years from now, like what are the circumstances going to look like? You probably would have said, if I want this asset to live a long time, and I'll tell you, I've learned in B2B likes to keep stuff, right? Like they look at capital assets and say like, it would be great if this had a lifespan over a decade, which like the consumer industry, like they shop at H&M, right? Stuff doesn't last a long time. Then, it's important to have that long range view. And so that's where, I look today and say, this is how we solve this problem now, but what is going to be different about capabilities and technologies 5 years down the line that might cause us to think differently? Are we prioritizing in a way that serves us well over the long term? And are there things we need to be investing in today to be ready for answering the business strategy tomorrow that aren't things we can turn on a dime, right? Like your cloud strategy isn't something you want to concentrate for.
Got it. And you can convince your leadership that the longer term, using your cloud analogy 5 years ago, the cloud maybe wasn't ready yet, or it's coming. This thing's coming. AI is coming. These things are on their way. CEO board, we should invest $2 million in this thing that's coming. They're listening. They're willing to invest in things like that. I mean, how do you make that case? It must be hard.
I think it's important to take people on the journey with you. right? Like you need to be constantly educating, and like, educating senior business leaders is something that has to be done thoughtfully and intentionally. Like their journey to learn is going to be different than yours as a technology specialist. But, there is a curiosity and a desire to understand how technology changes are going to impact the business. And you see it, right? Like you find me a company where the CEO hasn't asked about ChatGPT, like, right? Like there's tremendous curiosity. Like, what does this mean for us? This technology is wild. I've never seen anything like this. What does it change?
So,
there was a moment where the cloud was the thing, right? Like I've heard about the cloud, but I don't know what it is.
right.
Right. And if you could clearly articulate what it meant, I think there was a lot of room to engage there and like have a good conversation about making good long-term investments.
Yeah.
And again, I go back to like supply chain is the best analogy I have in B2B, because B2B companies I've learned are just brilliant at thinking about supply chain, at least the ones I've met. And they do a great job of looking at like trends of information, both in terms of capability and labor market and geography, density, all these things, right? They're very good at thinking about the future and saying, how do I make a good decision where if I build a building, that's going to be the right building for a long time.
Right.
And if you think about the framework that they're good at using to assess a decision like this, you just think about how to articulate technology in a similar framework. And I'd say it's not tremendously difficult to get them to follow along with you, right? I mean, these are curious, intelligent people who do the jobs they do because they're very good at making strategic decisions. It's just a matter of framing the information in a way that aligns with how they've decided to assess decisions like this.
Yep. Murugan, I know you have some burning questions here. Hop in.
Yep. I'm just curious, Ellery, with this whole sort of the slant towards seeking to capitalize investments made into tech on the B2B side. Does that kind of how does it sit with build versus buy decisions? Does it change how you survey that land altogether?
There's a reckoning, right? Because traditional software and infrastructure has been capitalized in most companies for a long time. And even if the music stops today, you're going to be paying the bill for the next 5 years. And so the reckoning, of course, is as you move to SaaS and cloud and things that are inherently OpEx, you're kind of paying double for a while, right? You can't kick the can into the future. That's where this long view becomes important, right? If your company's planning for something like this, if they understand it, if they see it coming and you can thoughtfully manage the transition, then it's very manageable, right? If it comes up at the point where you're tactically putting a budget in and it's like, oh, by the way, this isn't capitalizable and we're going to, sort of be double paying because we're going to be paying amortization and now we're going to be paying this on top. That's kind of a little bit too late to have that conversation. And then I would imagine, your finance team will have justifiable reasons to be grumpy. But if you're taking people along early and they see it coming and they understand it and they can kind of work their way through it and negotiate with you about what the right cadence is, then I think it's very manageable, right? But it is a complicated thing. Depending on your company's financial position, like it could impose some limitations as you kind of unwind paying out amortized investments from the past at the same time you move to a model that does not afford that.
And Ellery, a quick follow-up on that. In your role as a CIO now, you're obviously not only looking at the digital front office of the site, it's everything vertically integrated. So do you see the digital investments kind of driving how you look at your system of records, or is it really the system of record transformations that then unlocks new avenues for you in the front office? How are you playing that?
I think I look at it very much like many companies. If you're thinking in the product model, you're starting with a customer opportunity, which becomes a business strategy and imperative, which becomes systems of engagement. And then everything under the systems of engagement exists to support the systems of engagement, right? And so the question is, what is the right strategy as you go deeper into your stack around? And it's the same way we just talked about infrastructure, are we going to be in cloud or data centers? As you look at your systems of record, how do those evolve over time to support the needs of the business? But more than that, anyone who's ever been through an ERP transition, like it's like a harrowing experience. Like I think if you were to ask a CIO who'd been through that, would you rather be, marooned on an island for a few years or re-implement ERP? They would need to think about that. Like, tell me more about this island. Does it have good weather? Is there food? Which ERP am I doing?
Right.
And so like the idea that you could...
That was the punchline.
That's reality, man. If you were to start to be able to simplify what ERP does and kind of fragment it into more rational, manageable pieces of technology because your systems of engagement are organized that way already, that I think gives you a lot of future flexibility. It defrays what are really scary costs. Like forget the whole like, hey, I'm going to kind of unwind some amortization and shift capitalization into operating. You come and talk to your CFO about I need to amortize an ERP reimplementation. Like you got to like walk in there and flak jacket. Like that's a hard conversation and justifiably, right? Like if someone came into my office and said, hey, I'd like to spend 9 figures on something that has a very intangible ROI, like I would struggle. And so to be able to move away from that as a paradigm, I think is really interesting. And I think of it less that systems of record enable systems of engagement to become more flexible, but actually the other way around, right? Mm-hmm. More rational, discrete systems of engagement, as you think about sort of the modern microservices architecture, allow you to have a very different systems of record structure than what you've had before. Mm-hmm. And as you get to a place where you're just at the natural part of the life cycle of that asset where you have to invest in modernization, it lets you think very differently and have options you may not have had before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So one sort of slightly different topic, Ellery, I'm curious, as you think about your prioritizations, as we were, to our earlier discussion, what role, if any, and you're an Amazon guy, so, kind of thinking about this from the history of Amazon a little bit too, and how they've grown up. What role do you think competitors play, or how do you guys integrate that? Does that play any role in deciding what you do?
So I think anyone who tells you that they're not aware of their competitors is being a little bit cute. I think you have to pay attention always because your customers do, right? Like you need to be aware of what is being offered to your customers all the time. Just to make sure that you're being responsive and listening and offering what they need. And a great way to know that. And I'd heard Jeff Bezos say, when a new company pops up and succeeds in a space where we play, that is an indication we failed at something. Mm-hmm. And he was specifically in the time we heard him say that, referring to Instacart.
Interesting.
That's a space we should be winning. And the fact that they just appeared out of nowhere and found success is our indication that there's something the customer wanted, we weren't understanding and we're not offering.
Yeah.
So I think of it in terms of they're a really good barometer of your customer. Mm-hmm. But I would also say that equally important is not necessarily competitors in the sense of who's offering the exact same goods or services, but who else is operating in your customers' space, who is informing their expectations.
Very interesting.
And so I would be super keen to follow what someone who's selling them business supplies or financial services is doing and ways in which they're simplifying the customer's life, because that's going to change their expectations of me, right? Why can't you do what they do? And that's going to change their satisfaction with me as someone, who's ultimately a provider to them. And so I think it's less about this traditional, foot race against the next company that looks like you, and more being well attuned to everyone who's interacting with your customer and selling them goods and services and how they're doing it, to make sure that you're understanding where there were things the customer wanted or needed that you hadn't picked up on, that you need to incorporate into what you're offering, or at least, put into your plans and your thinking.
I love that barometer. The new startups that are growing quickly are a barometer of how well you're meeting your customers' expectations and needs. That's I haven't heard that put that way, and I think it's a great that's a great point. Murugan, you have another question, I think.
Right. So, Ellery, given the complex sort of customer landscape that you serve at McKesson, you then tend to kind of slice them down by chunks or big persona types, and then look if there's a completely different solution for each of them.
Yeah. Short answer is yes, right? I mean, we serve patients directly. We serve patients indirectly, right? Like in a business to business, in a B2B2C model, right? Like business to business to consumer. We serve many different classes of business, right? We serve medical practices and of all different kind of sizes, configurations, specialties. We serve pharmacies. We serve care facilities. We also serve drug companies and insurance companies in different ways, right? We have many different lines of business around enabling healthcare. And the customer personas are extremely different. And so this is kind of in the beginning where I said the complexity is the overlay in B2B. Like we have to think through like what are the common components, and a lot of this has to do with data that are become kind of the connective tissue throughout that link everything together. And then where do we differentiate the right stack of technology to deliver the right experience for each one of those different, personas or cohorts. And sometimes we'll find that things can overlap. Something we use to serve one can be, repurposed to serve another. Sometimes it's completely bespoke because the needs are just so different. And part of our success at McKesson is embracing complexity, right? Like rather than say it's easier for us to streamline everything and say we're just, we're going to do it one way, exactly our way, and that's it. We do try very hard to meet the customer where they are. And so that then forces more differentiation into our ecosystem than otherwise would be there. But again, it's aligned to the business strategy, right? Like we focused on building the muscle of being good at embracing complexity in order to be able to have better customer centricity. And that is different, right? Like when you're a highly agile B2C company, like simplicity is part of that agility. And for us, it's a little bit different, right? Customer centricity for us is turned out to be the opposite. We're willing to embrace complexity because it allows us to say to our customer, we're not going to force you to change or, to sell for something that's suboptimal for your needs. We're going to take that on ourselves and we're going to figure out how to integrate that into our technology and processes. And it's a continuous process, right? As our customers are, going new places, wanting new things, we're continuing to add and then finding on the back end ways that we can simplify, rationalize, streamline, to be able to then find efficiency to keep agility. I would say that's a muscle we're still working. Like, we're going to be doing that one a lot. But, at the end of the day, I think for a lot of B2B companies, that can be a powerful differentiator.
So, Ellery, this is great. We're coming towards the end of our time together. I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, you've got all this great experience across different companies, types of companies. What advice would you have for a new CIO or chief digital officer, someone coming into a company, perhaps that company is new or early in their digital transformation journey? Perhaps the traditional, the C-suite maybe doesn't have a lot of familiarity. This is new for them. Maybe they're willing to listen, but aren't convinced necessarily. I mean, you've probably been in this situation. What advice would you give to the person coming into that role, the CIO or CDO or whatever, about having success? You've clearly had some good success. Tell that person something they can use or benefit from.
Yeah. I think about, what are the things I would have liked to have been told earlier in my career? This assumes I would have listened to older me, which, was a question, but assuming that younger me was having like a really wise day. The first one is to know your business really, really well, right?
Okay.
Like we become technologists because we like solving problems and making things, right? But like you need to fall in love with the problems of the business and you need to know them intimately and be able to talk about them the way that your sales or your marketing or your operations teams do. Because at the end of the day, like everything you create is for benefit of what they do. And so like, it is not for them to figure out how to make technology work. It's for you to make technology work for them. It's understanding that as the lead technologist in a business, you really are a Sherpa, right? Like everyone's going to the top of the mountain with you. And like on this cloud thing, like you're not, like CIO is not the one going to the top of the mountain. Everyone's going to the top of the mountain. We as a business will move there. My job is to help you get there and sometimes to carry your stuff and to convince you that we can get there and we need to keep going. But that is to say, like, they need to go on the entire journey with you. Like, you can't phone them from the top and go, okay, I'm here. You guys head up. Like you're doing it together and it's your job to help them. Right. And technology is something everyone needs to have ownership in. And it can be easy early in your career to feel like, but that's going to slow me down. And it does, right? Until you would otherwise hit a brick wall, which is, we have no idea what you're talking about. We don't understand why we would do that. And we don't want to come with you, right? It's like, it would have been way faster to patiently, take the hands of your partners and bring them along with you. Even if it feels slower at first, like it's the way you actually get to finish the journey. You don't crash your business into change. You like thoughtfully guide them through it. And then I think the last thing that I would say is that, it's a job that requires you to be both patient and impatient. Like you have to be impatient in that you're constantly, constantly dissatisfied, like with good enough. You're always trying to find a better way, right? A better way to serve a customer, to serve your employees, to make something work better. You have to be patient when a lot of times, the moment isn't right for your specific business to take that leap. And that has to be okay, right? It can't dampen your enthusiasm. You just keep going, right? Beth Comstock wrote an entire book about this, Imagine It Forward, which was like, she was trying to teach GE how to be digital, like back when GE was a company that built giant industrial machines and she wanted them to become a digital company. And like, these people who were like, we build machines here. Like, what are you talking about? Software? Like it was like a lot of getting told no, or I don't understand that, before she like was able to start making them a little bit curious. And then the curiosity became interest, and the interest became willingness, and the willingness became conviction, and it became a totally different business. Right. And I think, that's really important to internalize, that, that it's uphill and that's how it's supposed to be. Right. Like, it requires you to be patient, keep going.
Yeah. A lot of what you described is really being a collaborator, almost an internal champion, salesperson for change, more so than even being a technologist is the way you're describing it. More your job is really aligning, right? And selling and taking people on the journey. I heard you say the word storytelling and journey like many times. Sherpa, good analogy, right? Well, awesome. Murugan, any final questions for Ellery before we wrap up our chat? No? Okay.
No, you stole my words. I was going to say it all sounded like techies are, at the end of the day, an empathetic Sherpa. And I'm so glad you said Sherpa. So the mountain analogy is possibly what triggered that mental image in all of us. So thank you so much for that analogy.
Yeah,
that's technology is a people business, right? Like everything else, like it's about the people.
Yeah, it really is. So, well, Ellery, thank you so much. We appreciate you joining us today for our Master B2B Fireside Chat series. We didn't have a fire here, guys, but next time maybe we'll bring a fireplace along or something. But appreciate your time, Ellery. Fantastic wisdom and insight, folks. Thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for our next Fireside Chat coming up soon.